Welcome, namaste, assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, good evening, good night to all of you. We are so pleased to have people from this meeting from all over the world in different time zones. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago, a teacher for the past 15 years, and this is our 176th edition of our Zoom public meeting. We wish to sincerely thank all of you who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 175 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. And in the past 3 years, 7 months, and 3 weeks, we have featured 743 presenters from all parts of the world, speaking on 175 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. So in order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are kindly asking for your suggestions for volunteers as well as donations. And you can contact Dr. Kumar Mahabir for details. Ladies and gentlemen, our moderator this evening or tonight is again Shalama Mohammed, the co-director of this Zoom platform, who is a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. Shalama, welcome.
Thank you so much, Shakir. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste. Very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for choosing to be here with us. Our meeting today will take the form of a panel discussion, followed by questions and comments from members of the audience after all our presenters have spoken. The entire program should last about 2 hours. Our meeting is being recorded live and would be uploaded later on YouTube permanently for posterity. We are also live streaming on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, so welcome to all of you on YouTube. In order to avoid intrusions from trolls, our IT manager, Ravan Ramsingh, has muted everyone. Speakers, please do not admit anyone, do not unmute anyone, and do not allow anyone to share your screen. Thanks so much for cooperating. Today we are talking about interrogating the declaration of CARICOM as the 6th region of Africa. Now, yesterday, St. Vincent and the Grenadines marked Indian Heritage Day. So I want to say congratulations to all Indo-Vincentians and all the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a member state of CARICOM. And CARICOM is an acronym for the Caribbean Community and Common Market. Essentially, it is a group of 20 developing countries in the Caribbean that have come together to form an economic and political community that works together to shape policies for the Caribbean region and encourages economic growth and trade. CARICOM was declared the 6th region of Africa at the 2nd annual Africa CARICOM Day last month at the University of the West Indies regional headquarters in Jamaica. The event was organized by the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, who is also the UWI Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. It was attended by former Jamaica Prime Minister P.J. Patterson and CARICOM's Secretary General, Dr. Carla Barnett. In highlighting the historical ties of the African Union's recognition, Patterson said, "The ethnic origins and commonality of our colonial experience are beyond dispute." But CARICOM's website itself places much pride and emphasis on the region's diversity. The text in the website reads, and I quote, "The Caribbean is home to approximately 16 million citizens and from the main ethnic groups of indigenous peoples, Africans, Indians, Europeans, Chinese, Portuguese, and Japanese. The community is multilingual, with English as the major language complemented by French and Dutch and variations of these, as well as African and Asian expressions." Close quote. It is in this context that the central question we plan to address in today's discussion is, can CARICOM rightfully be declared as the 6th region of Africa, when the Caribbean also has historical, economic, and cultural links with many other countries and continents? Let's hear from our speakers. And we begin with Professor Patricia Mohammed. She's a pioneer in the development of gender studies at the tertiary level in the Anglophone Caribbean. She is also the former first director of the School of Graduate Studies and Research at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. Welcome, Professor Mohammed. Go ahead with your presentation, please.
Good evening, everyone. And it is, first I want to congratulate the ICC on the track record. I just listened to your introduction and clearly, you know, congratulations are in order. This is a difficult task to lead, be the first speaker on this panel. And I'm sure there'll be some repetition, but I'll jump into it immediately. My presentation, in fact, seeks clarification on what exactly does this mean, being a sixth region, and raises some questions that are being flagged by this new branding of the region. In order to preserve time, I'm given 15 minutes, I will not be actually reading the text of the slides. They are presented and placed as supplementary data for the viewer to scan as I advance the argument. And I will tell you when to, because you are operating it, I will say when to move the slide forward. Now, as you said, on Wednesday, September 20th, the Newsday article was headlined, CARICOM has been designated as the sixth region of the African continent. Now, this news came as a surprise. There was no referendum or an attempt at consultation, or if there was, it was a well-kept secret. The intent, supported by heads of state and government of CARICOM and Africa, is to strengthen collaboration and unity, and to foster increased trade, investment, and people-to-people engagement between the two regions. This move was in motion since the first CARICOM Africa Summit in 2021, chaired by Uhuru Kenyatta, President of Kenya, who is also the chair of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. Can we move to slide 3, please? PJ Patterson's comment, which you also spoke about in the introduction, clearly speaks to those of African descent and makes no concession to the existence of any other race in the region other than the fact that we all share the colonial experience. Slide 4. The Newsday says that CARICOM is designated, but the African Union language is that of recognition. Now, this may be split in hairs, but who is recognizing who? What exactly is the sixth region of Africa? I tried to research this. Within the African Union, there are 6 designated regions: North, West, Central, East, and Southern Africa. The last region is defined as the African diaspora. What, therefore, actually constitutes the African diaspora? Is it like the original Greek and Jewish meaning of diaspora, referring to everywhere Africans have dispersed, past and present? The current Oxford Dictionary defines it as people who have moved away from their own country. What constitutes their own country then? If one is a third or a fourth or a fifth generation born in another location. There's a persistent semantic confusion, perhaps a deliberate one. By definition, therefore, the African diaspora extends beyond the Caribbean. A Princeton University project estimated that about 130 million people in Latin America are of African descent. If we move to slide 5, and I have 2 tables here, looking at the Caribbean in particular, in particular, and in Canada, Netherlands, Britain, France, approximately 22 million, that's the figure at the top, 22 million Afro-Caribbean immigrants live in these territories, compared to a mere 1.5 million of Indo-Caribbeans, if these figures are correct. Now, this latter, the 1.5 million, might seem to be an insignificant percentage, but let's look at the impact of small populations. In the 2021 British census, 1% or just over 600,000 of the total population classified themselves as Black Caribbean in the UK. Yet currently there's hardly a single advertisement on British television, and I can vouch for that. I've just spent the last 5 months there. that does not acknowledge the presence of a Black community or of a multicultural population. With exploration and discovery of the New World over 500 years ago, the Caribbean has been locked into trade, migration, and political arrangements, primarily with North America, the UK and Europe, and with China and others. We have been constituted and saw ourselves for over 500 years as Western New World inhabitants. While not culturally leaving our mother countries behind, we are largely bred on a Western consumer and media diet. And thus our gaze turned naturally over the last 7 decades post-independence to the North, including for travel and leisure. We have as deep a history of European culture as we have of Africa, India, or China, and others. And what are the large indigenous groups in places like Guyana who maintain their indigeneity? Of course, there is merit to seeking different partners to further extend our trade horizons. If we move to slide 6, Dr. Carla Burnett, Secretary General, makes a convincing case for the shift in partnerships. She stated that the first summit was convened virtually against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic to combat vaccine hoarding by high-income countries, which threatened our public health system. If we move to slide 7, she speaks to the formal partnerships with trade and investment relations. I may have moved it forward a bit, but it's okay. The establishment of an Afro-Exim Bank with Caribbean headquarters scheduled to be open in Barbados. This, according to Barnett, will allow the community to access financing for trade promotion in a range of sectors and possibly using a system of Pan-African payment as a method of intra-regional payments within the Caribbean. Now, this is welcome news, as the role of CARICOM as a common market to stimulate trade and investment to grow these societies is central to the common market agenda. And there are other key areas of alignment, such as climate change initiatives under the SDGs. And here we find many parallels between the African and the Caribbean nations as recipients rather than contributors to climate degradation. We agree that we must seek out partners whom we can work with as the economic and political world continues to realign itself. The USA, with the USA, the European community, the BRICS bloc of developing countries, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and others. But perhaps, and what gives me pause, is that this is a message that our university professors and statesmen need to be more transparent about and explain, rather than relying slight journalism printed in a single newspaper article and internal UWI releases to staff. This ignoring and silencing of the cultural symbolism inherent in such a partnership sends unfortunate signals to those who are not defined ethnically as part of the African diaspora. If we move to slide 6, even while forging new partnerships, we must be careful to avoid disaffection from populations who fear what this might mean in more tangible terms. We are on slide 6 now. I checked with, and this is the questions I'm asking, I checked with several learned colleagues, including legal experts, and some of the questions that were raised by them, and none of them, by the way, had heard. Can you move to the next slide? Right, you're right. None of them had heard before of the 6 regions. So everyone I checked with, this is the first time they were hearing. Some of the questions they asked is, are there any documents emanating from these meetings? What does formally designated mean? Is it that CARICOM General Secretary has endorsed this on CARICOM's behalf? Does this have to be ratified at a CARICOM Heads of Government meeting, or is this a done deal? If we move to slide 6, there's another question that was raised to me. Can we move to slide 6? I'm sorry, 9. I'm sorry, slide 9. Correct. What reciprocal relations are there for trade and movement of labor? For example, the CSME, the CARICOM Single Market Economy, which is intended to better position member states to grow by having access to using the resources of the region. There's been a 6th region of Africa entitled Free Movement of Labor from the 5 African regions into the Caribbean. Does it have impact on property owning, on other aspects? I want to leave out, in the interest of time, the next slide, which is on the issue of it's possible. And if we move to the next slide where people can read briefly, there may be an impact on furthering the cause of reparatory justice as argued by the Vice Chancellor, and putting that into the hands of CARICOM government, but this hasn't been fully explained on how the sixth region, being a sixth region, will advance it. That may come up for questions. So I want to move in to another area, and that is the next slide. The optics of branding. Now, the optics of branding and naming in today's media technology world is crucially important. We inherited the land from the indigenous groups who were here before us. For better or worse, the journeys of those who have crossed the Black Water and the Middle Passage, and those who have European heritage, those who have migrated as traders, such as Syrian Lebanese communities, and the others who have all joined. All of us have forged new cultural dynamics on this side of the Atlantic. And in doing so, we have shed the worst aspects of class, caste, and tribalism, in my view, and have created at least the ideological promise of a multicultural state. Does demographic dominance give any one group the right to determine its future identity unilaterally? What message is this sending to other ethnic populations? What does being the sixth region of Africa mean in particular for Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, who have considerably large Indo-Caribbean populations? What does it mean for our culture and our identity now and in the future, and our politics? And are we trading the European branding for Pan-African one? So we move to slide 12, where I end shortly. And I want to end, and I say this very honestly because I'm a student of world history, and I think deeply about the way in which any decisions we take, if we are to undo the past, need to be aware of history. I want to end with threats for the future when such decisions are taken without serious consultations. And what have we learned from the past? There's an underlying philosophy that is threaded through dictatorships and fascisms of all kinds, the need for purity of race and demographic dominance of power as a means of continuous control of resources, as if the politics learned and inherited from those before us cannot be changed. Now, these ideologies are more easily spread, especially in periods of disaster with growing climate change, the shortage of land, food supplies, and other natural resources. And generally, the survival of the fittest has been equated with who controls power, a false premise that we should learn to live against if possible. The examples of these are legendary in the past. I have not gone back very far, but just in 20th century history to know, the Jewish Holocaust, Poland and Germany, Muslims from India and the formation of Pakistan, the migration of Indians from Uganda, the migration of Indians from Guyana and Trinidad to Canada and the US, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our contemporary example, and these are just a few. There's an unshakable perception in the Caribbean that Indians and other ethnic groups are wealthy, that they control businesses and are the primary entrepreneurs, that they have no levels of poverty, that their men are not at risk as a gender, and especially that Indians dominate in certain professions. The qualification that these were the options available when other areas such as the public sector was closed or limited is never discussed as a parallel. We have seen from world history how easily populations can be feared, expelled, destroyed, controlled because of their perceived wealth, and how they can be forced to migrate or become subject to dictatorships and be subject to many forms of violence. Is this a possible scenario for future if we continue along this path of non-consultation and lack of transparency? I end with more questions and answers, as no officials or websites have as yet preferred these. I thank you for listening, and I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohammed. That was a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. As we said earlier, we will take questions and comments from the audience at the end of all the presentations. So I want to thank you very much, and I'll ask members of the audience to please hold your questions, make note of them, and we certainly will have them addressed. We want to move on now to our second speaker, and this is Professor Clinton Hutton. He's the director of the Institute of Technological and Educational Research at Micro University College and a distinguished scholar at the P.J. Patterson Center for African Caribbean Advocacy at the UWI. Welcome, sir. You can go ahead with your presentation for 15 minutes.
Thank you. I need not repeat some of the issues raised by Professor Mohammed, but I begin on the basis of looking at the history of Africans in the Americas. I won't deal with this era, safe to say, that is now on the screen, safe to say that there are 6 regions designated by the African Union with respect to African geography on the African continent. And the diaspora is deemed to be Africans beyond the continent. And of course, there's a historical shift in which millions of Africans were taken out of Africa for over 3 centuries into slavery. And the desecration and elimination of native people in the Americas, First Nation peoples in the Americas, to a great extent. I mean, over 20 million native people of Mexico, for example, were eliminated as a result of that. Now, in the history of, we can move to the other slide. In the history of these, the other one, please. In the history of the Africans in the Americas, there was never a time when there was any disconnection between the Africans who were brought to the Americas, including the Caribbean, some 20 odd million, and those from Africa. And in terms of the shaping of the journey of these Africans who were brought to the Americas, they use the African philosophical, aesthetic, spiritual traditions to guide their resistance to slavery. Resistance in the form of culture, resistance in the form of insurrections and other forms of political struggles. So they rely on Africa that they develop in the Caribbean, if we're speaking specifically of the Caribbean, which they developed guided by these ancestral philosophies, ancestral ontologies. And we know that when slavery ended, I mean, what I have on the slides, and there are several slides, there are some examples of what I'm talking about. So we can actually move the slides one by one. We can go to the next one. And I am not in any position, because of time, to explain what these traditions meant for freedom, what they meant for the connection with Africa, and what they meant for the culture in the Caribbean. The culture in the Caribbean, and as it expressed itself in popular forms and traditional forms, is dominantly represented by the African experience. Of course, there are many other experiences, Professor Mohammed talks about that. So there has always been this connection. And in the history, it's in fact, it is a history of the African diaspora, broadly speaking in the Americas and specifically speaking in the Caribbean. And so even though Africans were not able to transmigrate except for the funeral rituals that they had all across the Caribbean during slavery and after, that connection remains. And then, of course, we have the African intellectual tradition, in which the interrogation of slavery, the interrogation of post-slavery colonial society, not just in culture, but in intellectual forms, were used to sue for freedom, for sovereignty, for agency, but also to continue that link with Africa. And I have a number of persons involved. We can just reference a few of them, and we can change the slide. For example, go ahead, please, go ahead. Go ahead. Right, so let us stay there. So for example, Fanon tries to explain the psychology of this tradition of over 400 years of this journey of Africans who constituted the majority of the laboring force for almost all of that 400 years. And he was one of the leaders of the Algerian struggles for independence. And he's the author of Black Skin, White Mask, to explain that condition and the consequences and legacies of that condition. And of course, he wrote Wretched of the Earth. And we have Walter Rodney and his seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is an important part of that link between the African diaspora and the African continent. And of course, the explanation of what slavery meant in terms of the construction of the global order that decimated non-European peoples is work on capitalism and slavery. The same order that brought East Indians to the Caribbean and to other parts of the empire, for example, in Southeast Asia and so on. Although there were prior migration to that in some instances. And of course, we have CLR James. But let us touch primarily on Garvey. The overwhelming view that Garvey held about the development of the diaspora and Africa was that in order to prevent slavery, a recurrence of slavery, and the colonial subjection of African peoples, and indeed colonized peoples, generally speaking. You are familiar with Garvey's work. For example, his work in relation to the independence of India and of Ireland. Garvey's main point is that Africa has to be strong economically, politically, intellectually, and militarily to prevent what happened to its people to reoccur. And therefore, he advanced the slogan, Africans for those at home and abroad. One God, one aim, one destiny. The purpose of that was that while you develop where you are in the diaspora, it is like a duty to develop this continent. And to develop this continent meant a check of colonial powers located in Europe and what they did to the rest of the world. So that this has always been consistently, generation after generation, what the people passing the baton from one generation to the other always hold dear to their hearts. That freedom, that sovereignty is not just about freedom and sovereignty in the lands that they were imprisoned as laborers, but also on the African continent. And therefore, what he sees development, or the history shows the development of Africa should not proceed without the diaspora as part of that development. Africa itself has different peoples. There are East Indian communities in Africa. There are up north, you have Arab communities and so on. So there is not an issue of that being changed. The issue is, where is the place of those who have been subjected for centuries and emerge in the 21st century? What is going to be their place in the world? And that place is going to be determined by a number of alliances. South-South Alliance. And we have a history of them, Group of 77 and all of these things. The purpose of that is that one order subjecting the world to its diktat cannot be allowed to take place, because not only Africans will continue to suffer from this type of situation, but people who have been subjected to this global order coming out of the Colombian world order to this, what they call rule-based order today. And so when you look at the news globally, coming from that same order, you continue to see the desecration of the integrity, of the well-being, economic well-being, and political aspiration of people from what is called the global south. And this global south, Africa, is clearly a very important, a central part to play in this struggle. And that our development as a people, and if we read the history of how the Europeans conquered, including the history of India, China, other Asian countries, in the Americas, if we read that history is rooted in the division of African peoples, the division of non-European peoples. That is the basis of them dominating the world to this day. And if we are familiar with the news, and I'm finishing now, and if we are familiar with the news that is ongoing today, that same type of philosophy of division, which engender a clash between Canada, for example, and India at this point in time. That same philosophy of division in which some Africans are bought out to give away their country to France. Hence what we are seeing taking place there now. That the global South, in a large measure, will remain, if this division continues, will remain subservient to people who consider themselves to be better than other people in the world. And therefore, their ideas meant nothing. Their ideas for development, their ideas for expressing their cultural ethos, that these things must be subservient to Europe. And therefore, I locate the issue at hand in that framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hutton. Quite an explanatory presentation. Like Professor Mohammed, we will take questions and comments for you at the end of all the presentations. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have our third speaker now, and this is Omalur Wilson. She is the Youth Guild President at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in Jamaica. She's doing a major in marketing and a minor in tourism management and psychology. She's also a cultural ambassador who loves duck poetry. Welcome, Omalur. You can go ahead with your presentation for 15 minutes. Would you care?
All right, good morning, everyone. Are you seeing me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Good afternoon, rather. It's not good morning. My name is Omalur Wilson, and I am the history-making 2-time Guild President here at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. And I have been listening keenly to the presentations that have been happening since evening. And I feel as if I have been listening to just phenomenal persons talking about phenomenal topics. And at one point I started questioning myself to wonder if, am I looking at it the right way? But I had taken the option to look at just, when we talk about this declaration of CARICOM as a 6th region of Africa, I ventured into the aspect of what makes these particular personnel similar. Why is it that we would compare Africa to the CARICOM, the Caribbean community? And of course, after doing that, I took into consideration the fact that, we really need to look at the pros and cons of just this conversation overall. So let's just delve into it, yes? And I'm giving you from just a young girl's perspective, because that's the only perspective I can give you from. And I want to go ahead and begin. Now, I want to first venture into the aspect of what the CARICOM community is. I would have invited persons from my age group and younger to facilitate this conversation. So before we venture into the big conversation, we must first stop and wonder, what exactly do we mean when we talk about the Caribbean community. And CARICOM has been a pivotal regional organization comprising of 15 member states located in the Caribbean Sea. And being established from as early as 1973, its principles is economic integration, political cooperation, and shared cultural heritage amongst the member nations. But however, in recent years, we have witnessed an intriguing and paradigm-shifting development within our organization, a declaration that may be potentially redefining its very identity. And this development is none other than the proclamation of CARICOM as the 6th region of Africa. And the declaration represents a bold and groundbreaking initiative, one that transcends geographical boundaries, historical ties between the Caribbean and Africa. And this declaration holds profound significance for both regions and indeed the broader international community. And it's an affirmation of shared ancestry, cultural bonds, and basically a commitment to just mutual development. However, it also raises a multitude of questions and challenges, prompting an urgent need for rigorous integration. So let us embark on a comprehensive exploration of this historic declaration, aiming to dissect its origins, motivations, and implications. And I want us to delve into the historical context of CARICOM and its regional dynamics. I want us to look at its roots and the relationship between the Caribbean and Africa. I want us to dissect the significance of the declaration and the objectives it seeks to achieve. And we want to look at a multifaceted perspective on the declaration, grounded in its historical analysis, the political insights, and most importantly, its economic considerations. Yes? So, continuing, first, I want to look at the historical and cultural ties between the Caribbean and, of course, Africa. And the historical connection between the Caribbean and Africa is deeply rooted in the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 16th to the 19th century. And millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported to the Caribbean as part of a brutal slave trade. And this traumatic period in history left an indelible mark on both regions. Historians actually have extensively documented the horrors of the Middle Passage, where enslaved Africans endured deplorable conditions during the transatlantic journey. And when you look at notable scholars like C.L.R. James in his seminal work, The Black Jacobins, which I know many of you are familiar with, he has explored this history in detail. And he has offered critical insights into the Caribbean's role in the broader context of the African diaspora, which we just heard about from Professor Hutton. But it's not just the historical context, but the cultural influences and connections are there as well. Because the cultural influences and connections between the Caribbean and Africa are multifaceted and continue to shape the identity of the Caribbean nations. Now, these influences are more evident in music, dance, religion, language, and cuisine. For example, the rhythms of the Afro-Caribbean music, such as reggae and calypso, are rooted in our African musical traditions. And the vibrant and expressive dance forms like salsa and samba in the Caribbean draw inspirations from African dance styles. Additionally, religious practices like voodoo in Haiti and Santeria in Cuba have African spiritual foundations. Language is also another significant aspect of cultural connections, as many Caribbean nations have retained elements of African languages and dialects in their Creole languages, which are a fusion of African, European, and indigenous Caribbean American languages rather. And these linguistic ties serves as a living testament to the enduring influence of African culture. And we look at notable historians and anthropologists such as Stuart Hall, who have contributed to the exploration of these cultural connections. And in Hall's work on identity and cultural studies have delved into the complexities of Caribbean identity, acknowledging the African roots that are integral to Caribbean cultural mosaic, right? But I don't want us to just look at the historical and cultural aspect of it. Certainly, we must delve into the economic interdependence and trade relations between CARICOM and African nations. And the truth about it is economic ties between CARICOM and African nations have been steadily growing in recent years. And these expansions of economic relations have been driven by several factors, including shared historical experiences, the desire for increased trade diversification, and the recognition of mutual economic benefits. And you can see on the document here, I focused on three aspects: the trade volume, where according to the data from CARICOM Secretariat, the total trading goods between CARICOM member states and African countries has shown consistent growth over the past decade. And in 2019, the total trade reached approximately 694 million, which is a significant increase from previous years. And we have notable trading partners for CARICOM within Africa, which includes Nigeria, South Africa, and Ghana, with each contributing to a substantial portion of this trade value. But we also look at investments, as investment flows between CARICOM and African nations have been characterized by an increase interest in sectors such as energy, infrastructure, development, and agriculture. And the African diaspora has played a vital role in fostering investment and business connection between the regions. For instance, remittances and investments from Africa diaspora members have contributed to the economic development of both the Caribbean and Africa. But not just that, let's look at economic partnerships, because CARICOM and the African Union have initiated discussions to forge closer economic partnerships. And the African Continental Free Trade Area, that's AFTA, provides a significant opportunity for enhanced economic cooperation. So both CARICOM and AU are exploring ways to leverage AFTA to facilitate trade and investments. And of course, we have joint economic summits and forums, which have been organized to bring together business leaders, policymakers, and entrepreneurs from both regions to explore the new trade and investment publications. And when you look at the publications that are out there, scholarly research and publications have provided valuable insights into the evolving economic relationship between Africa and CARICOM nations. And studies such as the CARICOM, I think it's called the CARICOM Africa Trade and Economic Relations, and that's done by Dr. James Smith and Dr. Kwame Johnson. And I think what that has done is analyze the economic interdependence between the regions, highlighting the potential for increase trade in specific sectors like agriculture, renewable energy, and technology. So when you look at this in conclusion, the economic interdependence of trade relations between CARICOM and African nations have seen significant growth in recent years, yes? But I want to also look at the political and diplomatic cooperation between CARICOM and Africa, yes? For me, diplomatic relationships between CARICOM and African countries have evolved significantly over the years, leading to just basically numerous joint initiatives, collaborations in international organizations, and the pursuit of just common political goals. And I want to look at an example of a diplomatic tie, such as the diplomatic relationships between CARICOM and African countries are grounded in historical and cultural affinities. Both regions share a history of colonization, slavery, and the struggle for independence. And this historical backdrop has laid a foundation for diplomatic corporations based on shared experiences and common challenges. And one notable initiative that has strengthened diplomatic ties is our African CARICOM Summit. And this summit, held periodically, brings together leaders from African nations and CARICOM member states to discuss various issues of mutual interest. And it serves as a platform for dialogue and cooperation addressing topics such as trade, climate change, and global governance. But I also want to look at the fact that we also have joint initiatives and collaborations, such as diplomatic cooperations extended to various joint initiatives and collaborations that aim to promote development and economic growth and social well-being in both regions. Yes. And I want to look at the factors that drive the expansion of economic relations. For the safety of time, I want you to just look at them and just give it a title. But we also have to look at 1, trade agreements, 2, United Nations agreements, 3, health and education as diplomatic corporations extend to the areas of health and education. For example, partnerships have been formed to address healthcare challenges and improve access to education and trading opportunities. And then, of course, we look at successful diplomatic cooperation examples, such as Commonwealth membership, as many CARICOM member states and African countries are part of Commonwealth. We also look at climate change advocacy, as both regions have actively engaged in climate change advocacy. We want to look at South-South cooperation, where CARICOM and African nations have participated in South-South cooperation initiatives, sharing expertise and resources to address development issues. And in conclusion, political and diplomatic cooperations between CARICOM and African countries is multifaceted and vital for addressing shared challenges and pursuing common goals. But second to last, this is my penultimate topic, is the socio-economic challenges and opportunities. And the declaration of CARICOM as a 6th region of Africa carries significant implications for addressing shared socio-economic challenges and opportunities between the Caribbean and Africa. And I want to look at some of the things that we go through, because we both are experiencing poverty, because both the Caribbean and many African countries grapple with high poverty rates. According to United Nations, nearly 30% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa live in extreme poverty as of 2020. In the Caribbean, while some nations may have progressed in poverty reduction, pockets of extreme poverty persist, and that is not a debate. We also look at climate change, where the Caribbean and Africa are particularly vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Rising sea level, more frequent and severe hurricanes and droughts threaten both regions. And the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center reports that Caribbean nations face a substantial economic burden due to climate change. Lastly, I want to look at healthcare, as access to healthcare, or quality healthcare at that, is a common challenge in both the Caribbean and Africa. Limited healthcare infrastructure, inadequate funding, and a shortage of medical professionals hinders healthcare delivery. And the COVID-19 pandemic has further underscored these challenges. Yes? But cooperation to address these challenges stands strong, because for poverty alleviation, by pooling resources and sharing best practices, CARICOM and African nations can develop comprehensive policy alleviation strategies. I also want to look at climate change mitigation, as collaboration on climate change adoption and mitigation strategies is crucial. But in the aspect or to save time, healthcare collaboration by establishing partnerships for healthcare capacity building and infrastructure development can assist us with exchange programs for medical professionals, pharmaceutical cooperation, and sharing of pandemic response strategies can enhance healthcare systems. Additionally, joint efforts to access affordable vaccines and medicines can improve healthcare access for both regions. And then, of course, we have data reports and international organization, as seen on my PowerPoint here. Yes. In conclusion, addressing the socioeconomic challenges faced by Caribbean and Africa requires a cooperative approach that leverages their newfound status as regions united under CARICOM's declaration as a 6th region of Africa. But we know that there's a debate surrounding this CARICOM. region status. As a matter of fact, when Dr. Mohammed first spoke, she's making it clear that majority of us found out by a Gleaner article. I sat in the meeting that day of where the declaration was done. And I too was confused because I was wondering if such a grand thing is happening, where is the wide coverage of it so that the nations are well aware of it? But I guess that we work on it as time progresses. But the debate is there surrounding CARICOM 6 region status. And I asked young people, because my aspect will always come from young people, and I'm asking young people from the University of the West Indies. And these were the main arguments for it. We're looking at Pan-African unity in the aim of Marcus Garvey and other persons who have walked the line for Pan-Africanism. And we are looking at advocates of CARICOM inclusion, often emphasizes the history and cultural ties between the Caribbean and Africa. And we believe that this declaration is a symbolic step towards Pan-African unity, reinforcing the bonds for 2 centuries and shared history. And you look at scholarly works such as what's the name of that? African-Caribbean Relations by Karimu Welsh Asante, and it underscores the importance of recognizing these historical connections. We also look at economic synergy, where supporters contend that this declaration can lead to economic cooperation between CARICOM and African nations. And when you look at the African Development Bank and the Caribbean Development Bank, they provide valuable insights into the economic potential of such corporation. And of course, we look at global political influence as a pro for this declaration, because we can argue that this could amplify the political influence of both regions on the global stage. Yes, but we also must look at the arguments that are against this status. And we have to look at the geographical distinction, because we can argue that geographical separation between the Caribbean and Africa is a significant barrier to their inclusion as a singular region. And geopolitical experts like Robin Kaplan emphasizes the importance of geography in shaping political dynamics. We can also look at regional autonomy, where some Caribbean nations have expressed their concerns about the potential loss of autonomy and regional identity if CARICOM becomes the sixth region of Africa. And we worry about our unique challenges and priorities may be overshadowed by Africa's more extensive agenda. Yes, and of course comes the big one, which is resource allocation. And we can question how resources will be allocated between CARICOM and the existing African regions if this declaration was to be fully implemented. We can argue that such distribution can lead to internal tensions and inequalities, right? But I believe, as a young person, and we can always have this debate after, that the declaration of CARICOM as the sixth region of Africa would undoubtedly have profound implications on regional dynamics and global politics. It could potentially strengthen the bargaining power of both regions in international negotiations, particularly on issues related to development, climate change, and trade agreements. However, it can also lead to complexities in government and resources allocation. But in conclusion, the debate surrounding this encompasses a wide range of perspectives, each with its own merits and concerns, and this ongoing discourse reflects a complex nature of international relations and highlights the need for careful consideration of the implications of such a significant declaration. But I'm optimistic, and I want to see where we go with this. And I'm proud to have the opportunity to have given you this 15 minutes with plus stats of a young person's perspective of where we go. Thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion after, and I hope we have a fruitful evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wilson. That was a very informative presentation, and I too look forward to the questions after. Let's bring on our fourth speaker now. This is Dr. Adit Adian. He's a medical doctor working in the mental health care industry. He is the president and chairperson of the Council for Strategic Affairs, a think tank with an international outlook based in the USA. Welcome, Dr. Adit. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. I must express my thanks to Indo-Caribbean Culture Center for inviting me for this particular discussion. Let's start with the first slide. You have put the last slide. Let's move on to the second one. Unlike other speakers, I am neither for any of the CARICOM countries, nor from African Union. I'm based in US. My think tank has international outlook, and I'll be using basically a geopolitical perspective to discuss this question. Let's move on to the next question, please. I must say that I was very impressed and convinced with the questions Professor Patricia Mohammed, thrown at all of us. And some of those questions are very, very relevant about this declaration. So let's say hypothetically, European Union declares that Oceania, comprising of Australia and New Zealand, is a region of European continent. In this today's environment, in this today's geopolitical situation, how absurd that kind of declaration would be. Nobody has contemplated. When you declare some region as part of another geopolitical entity, there are not just two parties to it. There are not two parties, CARICOM and African Union. The 5 established regions of Africa are recognized by the United Nations. Is United Nations going to recognize this so-called 6th region as part of African continent? What would be the buy-in of the minorities in CARICOM countries? Has anybody thought of geopolitical implications before making an expansionist claim in geopolitical terms? Let's move on to the next slide, please. I've already covered that. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Move on to the next slide, please. So that gives you the geographical location of CARICOM countries. They are in Central America, they are in Latin American continent, and of course, there are island countries. What commonality geographically they have with the continent of Africa? That one fails to understand. Next slide, please. Again, let's move on to the next slide, please. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this happened on September 7th, which is Africa CARICOM Day. Good day for solidarity. Good day for sharing cultural values and all. But it is really not a good day to make a geopolitical claim, an extraterritorial claim about another continent, countries located in another continent. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Has been shown, good for solidarity. Let's move on to the next slide. And that shows you the flags of all the CARICOM countries. Let's move on to the next slide. I think Professor Mohammed discussed this particular issue, so I'm not going to repeat it. Let's move on. And again, that was discussed by Professor Mohammed. So this tells you that between CARICOM countries and African continent, you have a big, wide ocean separating. All the 5 regions are geographically contiguous to each other in African continent. When you make a geopolitical claim that CARICOM countries are the 6th region, you are laying actually a very troublesome question for future, because you are making a claim that may not be substantiated de jure, de facto, and it may have other implications. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this I'm showing South China Sea. What is the commonality between this CARICOM African Union being part of the same African continent. China, in its own wisdom, declared South China Sea as part of Chinese sovereign ocean. South China Sea that is shared by 10, 11 other countries that belong to ASEAN. And China is at this point in time claiming that islands and marine resources, which are in the exclusive economic zones of these ASEAN countries, belong to China. And it is creating a lot of geopolitical concerns to the extent that it may cause a war. Let's move on to the next slide, please. This again shows you the South China Sea and other countries involved. So let's see my rhetorical question. The blue in this map is the European Union. Of course, the Britain has gone out. And here at the bottom right, you have Oceania. Just because of shared culture, shared ancestry, shared ethnic origins, can European Union say that Australia and New Zealand are a region of the European continent? It would be highly absurd. Look at the distance geographically. Australia and New Zealand are part of Oceania. They have more in common with Pacific Island nations, despite having same colored skin, or same English language, or same culture. But geopolitically, they are in a different geopolitical region. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the basis of this declaration, as discussed by Professor Hutton and Professor Wilson, are ethnicity, shared colonial experience, cultural affinity, and reparative justice. Professor Wilson also talked about socioeconomic issues, and I will talk about that. Let's look at the fallacies of each of these arguments to justify a declaration of CARICOM as the sixth region of African Union. May I move to the next slide, please? What is the fallacy of ethnicity as a factor? In today's environment, we don't condone of an Anglo-Saxon alliance because it's a racist alliance. We don't condone China's claim on Taiwan or Singapore or Tibet on the grounds of shared ethnicity. Singapore is an independent nation despite having Chinese majority population. If ethnicity alone is the justification, why are there tribal wars in Africa? Why Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Tigray region, there's a conflict because all of them are Africans, all of them have the African ethnicity. Why Yemen is smoldering with a civil war when all the Yemenis are Arabs? And why there is a war between Ukraine and Russia, as both are Slavic nations? Actually, Ukraine is the origin of the Kiev Rus, birthplace of Russian civilization. If ethnicity alone is used to define geopolitical regions, then Mauritius, Fiji Island, and some of the Indian-dominated countries in Caribbean could be termed regions of India. If that argument alone is used, let's move on to the next slide. Move on to the next slide, please. Do you know who she is? She is the mother of all of us. She is Lucy. Lucy is the ancestral hominid who died 3 million years ago. Let's move on to the next slide, please. That's another impression of Lucy. Lucy was in Africa. Lucy is the human ancestor. Entire human race originated in Africa and migrated outwards to other continents. Even the Caucasian race is derived from the original African ancestry. Does it give right to Africa to claim entire world as one of its region? If we look at the DNA structure, the entire human race has more than 98% commonalities, despite outward external differences. The DNA variations, the DNA differences are minimal compared to the commonalities. So for God's sake, let's not invoke ethnicity. Entire human race has originated in Africa. Don't use ethnicity as a ground because it is racist. Next slide, please. Fallacy of shared colonial experience. India has shared colonial experience with most of the African countries. Britishers, colonized significant part of Africa and of course, entire undivided India. Does that make India a region of Africa, or conversely, Africa is a region of India? If we just focus on colonial experience, shared colonial experience, Ireland was a British colony once, so was India. On the basis of shared colonial experience argument, could we say that Ireland is a region of India? No. Hong Kong was a British colony, so was Jamaica. Both were British colonies, have shared colonial experience. Is Jamaica a region of Hong Kong or Hong Kong a region of Jamaica? Malta was once a British colony, so was Trinidad and Tobago. Can Malta today claim that Trinidad and Tobago are regions of Malta just because they had shared colonial experience? So these are sophisticated arguments devoid of actual rationale. Let's go on to the next slide. Fallacy of cultural affinity as an argument for declaration of CARICOM as the sixth region of African Union. Both Malaysia and Indonesia have strong cultural affinity. Can one country claim the other on the basis of just cultural affinity? In fact, both these countries went to war at one point in time. There's cultural affinity between Canada and US. Can one claim the other as its own region? Because there are geopolitical implications. There's cultural affinity between Singapore and Taiwan. Can Singapore claim Taiwan as one of its regions? There's cultural affinity between both India and Nepal. Can one country claim the other as its region? When you proclaim something as your region, you are making a geopolitical claim, which is very contentious in international relations. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Fallacy of reparative justice. Indians were victims of indentured bonded labor malpractice of the British Empire. Indentured Indian diaspora lives in countries like Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Fiji, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and host of other CARICOM countries. On the basis of argument of reparative justice, can India claim any of those countries where indentured Indian labor was transported by the British people against their will? None of them were willing migrants. So reparative justice again does not hold. And the last argument which Professor Wilson made was on the basis of economic interests, trade, investments, and other things. The biggest investment in African Union is actually from China. Would African Union like to be part of China? So each argument in this declaration used to define the declaration is fallacious if argument is looked at very closely. And this declaration does not pass the litmus test of racism. There can be racism of all varieties. Generally, we talk about European racism or Caucasian racism. But there's Arab racism, there's Han Chinese racism, there's Indian racism, and there is African racism. Let's be aware of that. When the power dynamics change, yesterday's victims can be today's oppressors. And we have seen it very well in African continent. We know what happened in Uganda. We know what happened in Tanzania. We know what happened in Kenya, where East Indian migrants were hounded, atrocities were committed on them. So let's not enforce African racism by shrouding it in palatable terms. There is arbitrariness in this declaration, and geopolitically it is dangerous because it will open a Pandora's box that would be very, very difficult to contain, and there'll be future conflicts or wars if this is accepted. It is analogous to a hegemonic China claiming entire South China Sea unilaterally. By equating African racism to a higher pedestal, it will create internal strife in all the CARICOM countries, which are essentially multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multilingual. My advice to CARICOM countries is that beware. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Beware. Remember the British policy of divide and rule? You are following the same path. You are dividing your own countries between a superior African ancestry section of the population and all other minorities. And this is going to be very difficult for future. If I can quote George Santayana, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. And by interfering in the internal political dynamics of majority versus minority in CARICOM countries, African Union is playing with fire. African Union was given a place in G20 by efforts of India. African Union is one of the candidates for permanent membership of United Nations Security Council. But if African Union indulges in hegemony, expansionism, and makes tall geopolitical claims, it will not help African Union. It will help African Union to do some self-introspection and take care of the problems in Africa, the 55 countries you have, rather than making a geopolitical claim to another part of the globe, which is far, far away. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Adit. It's a very analytical and compelling presentation. Thank you so much. Our fifth and final speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Andira Rasad. She's a UE lecturer in political science and an attorney at law. She's a former commissioner of the Equal Opportunity Commission in Trinidad and Tobago and a regular media commentator on local, regional, and international current issues. Welcome, Dr. Rasad. You can present for 15 minutes.
Okay. All right, we share screen. Good. I can't share screen. To share screen.
Okay, just 1 second. Robin will adjust that. Try it now.
Can you all see?
Yes, clearly.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, friends. My colleague from the UE, the Guild President, just to inform that I'm also in the struggle, the UE struggle, that is, third time elected president of the West Indian Group of University Teachers, the trade union representing academic, senior administrative, and professional staff at the St. Augustine campus. So it's good to see colleagues here and interesting presentations. Last presenter took a lot from what I had to say, but I will nonetheless try to engage this debate through, I'm not going to dwell too much on the Africa-CARICOM relations. That has been exhausted. What has not been exhausted or discussed to a great extent, except by the last speaker somewhat, is India-CARICOM relations. Just want to make the distinction that when you talk about regionalism and absorbing regions, this is a whole academic debate, which any scholar of international relations know, which speak to regional integration. And you usually engage in regional integration with your neighbors. This is the usual pattern with the European Union, the African Union, ASEAN, LAFTA, there are like 100 of them in Latin America. So many of them, and even in the Caribbean, we have the Association of Caribbean States, we have CARICOM, we have so many. You usually speak to association with your neighbors because it's facilitating, firstly, economic integration. Okay, so you're creating a free trade area, firstly, and then as it advances, you move into an economic union. And then when it gets very advanced, and which we haven't reached there, certainly not in the Caribbean, and many integration schemes have not reached, you go to a political union. The EU is the closest to having attained that so far, the European Union. And so CARICOM have even tried the economic union, but not succeeded with the currency, because every country is jealously holding on to their currency. So there have been failures in the Caribbean single market and economy with regard to common currency and other aspects of integration. So this is the 6 regions that has been explored, and this map has been shown already. We are seeing a diaspora. Professor Mohammed already engaged this notion of diaspora. The diaspora here, I don't think it was meant to be CARICOM. And this image, if you can see, is copyright 2017. Sahel and West Africa Club Secretariat 2017. So this initiative towards the diaspora, which has been interrogated in itself by the last speaker, Dr. Adit Adian, doesn't speak specifically or only to CARICOM. It speaks to the African diaspora, which is all over, and Professor Mohammed dealt with that. So I'm going through very quickly this initiative. There's a historical trajectory to this African CARICOM, a sixth region of Africa, CARICOM being the 6th region of Africa. There's a history to it, and recent history. I'm not going into long historical ties. I'm not taking a long durée here, and I'm not taking the Brodel's approach. Ferdinand Brodel's approach. I'm looking very briefly at how this thing started recently. So they had a first CARICOM Africa Summit with heads of government of Africa and CARICOM meeting to engage on matters of interest to them and how to forge deeper cooperation. And that was hosted by the president of Kenya. Then on August 31st, September 2022, Professor Mohammed spoke about this Trade and Investment Forum in Barbados, and where they created this Exim Bank, African Exim Bank in Barbados. And they were hoping to have another session of this in Guyana later this year in 2023. And then there was the 45th regular meeting of Conference of Heads of Government in July 35th in Trinidad, which Trinidad and Tobago hosted because it was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Chagarams in 73. But that whole initiative of Africa, or CARICOM being the 6th region of Africa, was never raised. I look at the agenda of that summit on July 3, 2023, right here in Trinidad, and certainly it would have been in the newspaper. It was never raised. I could not find it anywhere, where I think if they were going to make such a declaration has to be made at a summit. That is my understanding of international relations, especially when it involves a region. It has to be done where the heads of government are present, and all of them would have agreed and signed the declaration. So somebody asked the question, well, where was this declaration made? And we don't know. I don't know where it was made. I know it was verbally made. And we saw through the Newsday article, which Shalima cited at the beginning. It was verbally made at the University of the West Indies. But in July 21, 2023, this Global Africa People-to-People Forum was held, and they wanted to, this is a different forum, a different forum. They wanted to deal with building on visionary initiatives, reflections on the inaugural CARICOM Africa Summit, the summit of September 7, 2021. And this was a virtual forum, and I found the invitation to this forum. This is the invite, the African Union calling for, for people to come forward to listen to this and to advance the collective interests of people of African heritage while fostering strategic partnership and promoting cross-cultural exchange. But if we notice, partnering in collaboration with the Caribbean Pan-African Network Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. So they are the ones who started this forum, continued it in July 2023, okay? And then we saw this, I go back a little bit to 2020, when the same Pan-African Network talked about this, this partnership among people of African descent, both on the African continent and the diaspora. All right, so they brought it to 2023 because they were reflecting in that very invitation website what had happened in 2020. Right, and they said this year the forum will be geared towards spotlighting positive and concrete Pan-African endeavors and projects, etc. Right, so then comes September 7th, and we're now very familiar with this slide where we saw this in the newspaper, and this is all we have. CARICOM has been formally designated as a sixth region of the African continent. Who designated it? Where it was designated? Who signed the declaration? Because a declaration has to be signed. Was it our heads of government of the region, right? Or was it the our University of the West Indies initiative? Now, while I'm a member of the University of the West Indies, keep in mind, I'm not administration. Actually, I challenge administration because I'm union leader. So, so a battle with administration is something I certainly can raise too. I'm not afraid. I'm never afraid to raise anything. Okay, so what the most they can do is fire me, and then I will take legal action. So court, the thing will play out in the court. I always tell them that. So fire me and I will take legal action. I have no problem with that. Okay, so so the Vice Chancellor joined forces with Patricia, and they had this this forum, and that is where we hear that the declaration was made during the second annual Africa CARICOM Day at the UAE's regional headquarters in Jamaica. Can that declaration be made there? Were the heads of government present? Who signed the declaration? If the heads of government were not present, how legitimate? So now I am questioning the legitimacy of that declaration. Okay, so remember also I'm an affiliate law. One of the things I wasn't touched on was India-CARICOM relations. So it's not only Africa that has long historic ties with CARICOM, Professor Hutton and my Ms. Wilson, my erstwhile colleagues. They had relations with India, and I only mentioned November 2003. I said I'm not taking the long durée because it go back to 1845 when we brought Indian indentured laborers to the Caribbean, and probably even before that, the Indians and the Chinese were all over, as we know. So since the beginning of time, as we can go back. So here we have engagement, right? A CARICOM delegation being led by Katie Knight, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Jamaica, and he was then chairman of the CARICOM community, of the Community Council to India. They signed an agreement for establishing a joint commission on consultation, cooperation, and coordination. February 15, 2005, India was invited as a special guest to the CARICOM summit in Paramaribo in Suriname. All right, and these are the initiatives. I wouldn't go through them because you can see them on the screen. They're basically economic development, trade and investment, drugs, fighting HIV/AIDS. There are also other political initiatives, but more economic. You know, they talked about this project for computerization, value $1.3 million US, upgrading of ITC systems of the CARICOM Secretariat. And India has since been extending capacity building and development assistance to CARICOM countries in several areas. Then in June and September 2015, there were other high-level talks in Guyana. Georgetown, Guyana, and they discuss cooperation, capacity building, promotion of bilateral trade, etc. They focus on strengthening India-CARICOM bilateral relations. 2017, there were ministerial meeting, and so you have the information there on emergency aid and India UN Partnership Fund for Social Cooperation with CARICOM. And 2019, the Indian Prime Minister offered a 14 million grant to CARICOM member states for community development projects. Then there was the vaccine diplomacy in 2021. Guyana got 500,000, Dominica 70,000, Trinidad and Tobago 40,000, because we were playing proud that we didn't want nothing from nobody and we didn't even ask. And then they offered us 40,000 and we didn't refuse. So I think we can all remember that vaccine diplomacy, or lack of it, or lack thereof. And then Irfan Ali described this initiative from India as a tangible expression of goodwill in this challenging time. September 25th, 2019, this now is very interesting. The first ever summit between India and 15 member CARICOM countries took place in the United States. Why that would take the United States in New York? I mean, it's a question I asked, I don't have the answer. It took place on the sidelines of the 74th session of the UN General Assembly. So maybe that's why the UN General Assembly was being held. And they tried to deal there with climate change, human resource development, and technical capacity, health and education, etc., credit financing, and whatnot. So there are ongoing relations between India and CARICOM, and it's long. So there are also significant connections between India and CARICOM, as there have been between Africa and CARICOM, and as they have been between many other regions and CARICOM. So I now want to bring you all to the gist of my presentation, which is some, doctor who went before me had a lot of questions, more questions and answers. And I want to ask the question boldly, because there is an inherent irony in talking about, CARICOM as a sixth region of Africa. Is that a politics of exclusion, or is that a politics of inclusion? Or should I say policy of inclusion, or a policy of exclusion? So on the one hand, we're including CARICOM, Africa CARICOM, and on the other hand, we're excluding everybody else. And I am not just speaking about the Indians, okay? But the Indians would have a bigger grouse because they would claim that they have majority groups in some of the countries, Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, right? But what about Latin America? What about China, who actually is the biggest trading partner of the African Union, as Professor pointed out, Dr. pointed out before. What about other parts of Asia, which you also mentioned? Okay, so is this a policy now to alienate, marginalize, or is that I am just quarreling and grumbling? Is that just me quarreling and grumbling because I feel left out? And do I have a right to quarrel and grumble because I feel left out? Because the Africans do quarrel and grumble when they're left out. The Chinese would quarrel and grumble when they are left out. The Latin Americans do quarrel and grumble when they are left out. So I think I do have a right to quarrel and grumble too, right? Is this deliberate, or is it just unintended consequences? I teach this theory about naturalist and conspiracy theories. Is it the natural course of history that CARICOM would become the sixth region of Africa, everybody else excluded? That's natural course of history. I'm asking, or is it an unintended consequence that they didn't intend it, that it wasn't a deliberate, or was it intended? Was it an intended or deliberate consequence? And I ask this question because of this April Fool's statement made by Eric Williams, I think it was 1958, of the recalcitrant minority of Indians in the Caribbean. Indians being seen in Trinidad, in particular, Trinidad and Tobago, as a recalcitrant minority. It's something that the Indians have not forgotten. However, the Indians tend not to dwell on victimhood, and they move on, and they have moved on. Okay, and they're now quite doing well in business and education and health and engineering and science and you name it, and we know it. So I'm not going to go there and boast. I do think I have bragging rights nonetheless. Impact of the declaration. What is the impact of this declaration? So African Union is a region. CARICOM is a region. The region, outer region across the Atlantic. one region and not the others. I mentioned this whole politics of exclusion. What about reaching out to other regions? India is a state. India is a state, okay? India is not a region, but the population of India would be more than Latin America and the Caribbean combined. So almost 2 billion people. So if you want to talk about an economic space to have links with, relations with, ties with, one would think you would go to China and you would go to India as well. I'm not saying leave out Africa, you know. I'm not saying that at all. I am saying, because my theme here is the policy or the politics of inclusion. Because it is not good that these groups are sitting back, reading a Newsday article and feeling left out. And the people who have read it are up in arms because the headline was not becoming designated, declaration we don't know who signed. So is this deliberate? Is it insensitive? Is it that the other islands of the Caribbean, and maybe Guild President and Professor Hutton can help me here, because I didn't hear them mentioning these other groups. I am also talking about the First Peoples who would argue that they have first rights because they settled here first, okay? The Indians would argue that they have majority populations and that we are not a minority if we want to talk about numbers. But is it numbers we're talking about? When we bring ethnicity and race into the mix, what we are talking about, and I do not want to leave it out, is that of identity and a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion. Do we feel then that we belong to CARICOM if there is such an initiative which excludes the Indian population? How would the Chinese in the Caribbean feel when they have had so much successes in business in the region? We have Latin Americans in the Caribbean too. We have a Latin Caribbean. They're not members of CARICOM, but Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico are Latin Caribbean islands. Okay, but they're part of the Caribbean, not part of CARICOM. But they also have huge African populations. Where do they fit? Okay. Isn't this just now a competition for economic space? Is it that Africa wants this economic space in the Caribbean, okay, which is now dominated firstly by Syrians, because Syrians and French Creoles, they might be considered what we say is the 1% in local parlance. We have the Indians, which are the largest sector of the middle class, middle business group. We have Chinese, who are also a phenomenal space, and they're small, but they have a phenomenal space there. Is it that Africans are trying to, and I'm talking about from Africa, the African Union, to forge a space, because the Africans in the Caribbean were never denied that space. In fact, for most of our history, they have been our leaders and our rulers. So who was to deny them? They have never been denied that space. If they didn't succeed, it is not because someone stopped them, and certainly not because the Indians or the Chinese or anyone stopped them from getting that space. Okay? Whose initiative it is then to forge this kind of alliance? Whose initiative? Is it CARICOM's initiative? From what we hear, this was an African Union initiative. Did CARICOM acquiesce willingly? Did they challenge it? Did they make it known that we are multi-ethnic, multicultural region, and therefore if we do this, you know, when the president talked about challenges, I thought she was going there. She even mentioned the word inclusion. I thought she was going there. I thought she was going to mention these other groups in the Caribbean, which have been unceremoniously left out of this debate. Unceremoniously left out. Because when you talk about connections between Africa and the Caribbean, nobody denies that. Nobody denies the role of CLR James and Marcus Garvey and Rodney. Nobody denies that. That is well documented in history. But we also have other heroes from other races. We also have other heroes from other races. So let us confront the problematic. We need to engage the problematic. We need to take the bull by the horns. We need to understand why people are grumbling, why people are quarreling, why people are feeling left out. Okay, so let's go to the reparations. Now, I had told Kumara I wouldn't talk much about UB, but it's inevitable because the declaration was made by, at UB regional headquarters. And the reparations committee, ICC is not against reparations, but ICC insists, and I support the move, that reparations should include East Indians and the indentured laborers. That whole syndrome. And Professor Sir Hilary Beckles also talked about that. He said, frequently, he said it in his speeches, that it has to do with building upon the historic efforts of past organizations to bring justice to the victims of native genocide, chattel enslavement, and deceptive indentureship. Those are his words, which he often repeat, and which he says that it was supposed to be a trilogy. It was a how you call it in a play? Three acts in a play. Those are the terms he uses. But the reparations we are seeing, and we've recently seen initiatives by Guyana, the Gladstone initiative, where these Gladstones are originally from Scotland, apologize to the Guyana government, and they might be even getting some financial compensation for the enslavement of Africans in Demerara plantations and whatnot. So they're making some strides there, and if our countries can benefit from such compensation, I have no problem with that. But it has to go towards the development of the people of the country entirely. And Professor Beckles outlined where these kinds of funds will go to education and health and all that. So we're hoping that that will happen. He was also a champion for the Irfan Ali government when Granger didn't want to step down. We would recall that whole fiasco 2019-2020 with the politics of Guyana, and Professor Beckles joined with other regional leaders, including Mia Motley and Ralph Gonzalez from St. Vincent, Mia Motley from Barbados, in joining to suggest that the Granger government step down on the insistence of the observers. We would recall that the OAS observers, CARICOM observers, all of them insisting that, and even the CCJ judgment. So,
Dr. Rasad, I hate to stop you. Thank you. Final closing comments, please, so that we can take at least one.
So we have two slides: public versus the private sector. Political leaders, the will or nil, do they have the will to embrace these other groups in the society? Is there a role for the ICC in this, right? Can now the ICC approach India, the Indian government, the Indian High Commissioner to CARICOM, Trinidad and Tobago? Can the ICC engage CARICOM Secretariat? Can the ICC engage UWI's VC? Perhaps for UWI Indian Day or UWI Indian Arrival Day, can we ask for India being the 7th state of CARICOM? Can we ask for that? And are we out of place to do that? Okay. And similar questions to what Professor was asking before. Or is it ludicrous to do so? All right. So these are some of the telling questions I want to ask. But we have to think about this issue very carefully. We can't just talk about connections between Africa and CARICOM and leave it there. That does not end it. That does not end it. That doesn't even start it, this debate. It leaves out, it excludes vast majorities of population in the CARICOM region. It's a Caribbean community, and community means there's a social dimension to this. Community means a community of peoples, and the community of peoples in the Caribbean are of different ethnicities, different walks, different races, religions, cultures, and they have to be considered in any such CARICOM initiative. I thank you.
Thank you so much. A very informative and provocative presentation, Dr. Ramprasad, as always. I think for all of our speakers, we've had a very balanced approach to this debate. And now I want to take a question from Nadine Drummond. Nadine, if you are able to unmute your mic, please go right ahead. Okay, I'm not hearing Nadine. Dr. David Subran, go ahead, please.
Yes. I don't think that we need to become a region of Africa or any other country in order to further economic and cultural cooperation. I certainly don't wish to trade my Trinidadian and Caribbean identity for an African identity. I consider it a step backwards because I fear that the prevailing anti-democratic flavor of many African nations don't go down well with me. I'm talking about frequent coups, oppressive kingdoms, and so on. Those things have created doubts in my mind. Those who talk about slavery should listen to what Yoweri Museveni of Uganda recently said in his apology for the role that Africans played in the enslavement of their brothers to foster the Atlantic slave trade. He said that that slave trade could not have existed without the willing cooperation of Africa. Yet I note that reparations and other things close a blind eye to these things. We have the Caribbean community to develop, and we don't need far-fetched diversions. I think this is a step to become recolonized, and I reject that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comment, Dr. Subran. Nadine Drummond, would you like to try again?
Yes, please. Thank you, everybody. This was a rather stimulating debate and discussion. And I preface my comment and question with the fact that today I returned from Lagos on a cultural development mission with some ambassadors from Geneva in Switzerland, which is where I'm now based, from Barbados. This is a ridiculous contention. The Caribbean can never be the sixth continent of region of Africa for all of the reasons discussed and many others. And I think that people need to understand this as the political ploy, which it is, and we must not allow ourselves as Caribbean people in the region or in the diaspora to be distracted. It's very likely that Mia Mottley will run to be the leader of the UN. If she wins, she will be the Secretary General. Somebody has to win from our region. And I would like to ask those people who I respect, especially Professor Clinton, how do you think through trade and economic ties, the Caribbean, despite the fact we are a diverse population, will benefit from being, even though it's impossible legally, geographically, it's something that can't happen, but at least intellectually, how that will benefit our economies. And I say this in the face of climate change because this is something we don't speak about enough. How is the Caribbean, being the sixth region of Africa, going to help us survive climate change? I mean, that's my real question, because all of these trade agreements, all of these political and social and cultural ties with Africa, with India, how is it going to help us survive inclement weather? How is it going to help us survive the rising of sea tides? How is it going to help us survive the breakdown of multilateralism? How is it going to help us survive when in the next 50 to 100 years, most of our populations will be climate change refugees? This is our future. I'd like to know how this is going to help us survive.
Okay, Nadine, thank you for your question and your comment. Professor Clinton Hutton, it was directed straight at you. Would you like to respond?
Okay, I have a lot of things to say. Certainly the issue of climate change is an issue that the Caribbean community or Caribbean region has to contend with in terms of its own agency, in collaboration with other species other governments, peoples around the world? It's a very important question. It's a #1 issue in terms of regional and global importance, because the existence of human being is threatened by that. And there are lots of things that we can talk about under the issue of climate change and so on. There are a lot of things that we can talk about, but we don't have time for that. But there's a number of things, though, that I would like to speak to. I mean, I am hearing some very fanciful. I mean, look, how does Britain, being the colonizer of India and Jamaica, would cause a claim to be made for regional connection, or Malta, for that instance, or Singapore. I can't understand that argument at all. I don't understand what is being said. Right? That is baffling to me. And of course, the issue of democracy is another one, and what it means. What it means for decision making. What are the laws that defend, for example, right to life in many nation states is the first law of the Constitution, right? And of course, in that, it doesn't discriminate against any group at all or any individual, even though the culture of that particular country might do so. Right? So there are rules, and there is a cultural ethos of the particular space, right? The
Okay,
other
Professor
thing is,
Hutton,
yes.
Professor Hutton, we are already past our time. So would
Yes.
you mind just summarizing, please, so that we could get a rebuttal and then take our next question? Thank you.
You know, I didn't expect this. The issues being raised, for example, by Dr. Adit Adian, it contains some very fallacious arguments, right, in respect to regionalism being attached to the colonizing power. If a colonizing power colonize some other country, then are you going to use the argument of that?
Thank you. Thank you. We'll take a response now from Dr. Adit. Dr. Adit, go ahead, please.
So Professor Hutton does not have the capacity to understand a rhetorical question that I had asked. It is a part of logic, which is in Latin called reductio ad absurdum. I had used all the arguments used to justify this declaration, which is unilateral, which is oppressive to the minorities, which has far-reaching geopolitical questions. And frankly speaking, this declaration is based on Pan-African racism. It's elevating a section of CARICOM community to a higher pedestal as compared to minorities in those countries. And Professor Hutton refuses to understand that. And rather than answering the question that was asked by Nadine Muhammad, he starts attacking me. I don't understand the etiquettes here of Professor Hutton. I will rest my case at this point in time because I know we are short of time.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. We have one question from Dr. Hilary Brown. Dr. Brown, go ahead, please.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Hilary Brown. I'm the program manager for culture and community development at CARICOM Secretariat. So let me say thanks to all of the presenters for their provocative, start video. Okay, let me adjust my thing a little bit. You want to see me? Okay. Hi, good afternoon. So I just wanted to make a couple of points. I think that this was an interesting and provocative discussion. However, the premise of the discussion really is incorrect. There is no declaration of CARICOM as the sixth region of Africa. So I think the discussion here spoke to how the issues of inclusion and exclusion, which came through very clearly in all of the, in some of the presentations. But the fact of the matter is that the whole response here is to what you have to call irresponsible journalism. I am pretty certain that neither Professor Beckles nor former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson would have referred to CARICOM as the sixth region. The sixth region of Africa, and I saw two or three presenters put up the map. And the map is correct, that the sixth region of Africa declared by the African Union is the African diaspora. Some of that diaspora is in the Caribbean, some is in the United States, a big portion in Brazil and other parts of Latin America, and there's African diaspora in Europe, all over the globe. And what the African Union is saying is we recognize that history of oppression, that history of illegal trafficking of Africans out of the continent, that they are dispersed all over. They are recognizing the incredible intellectual contribution of Pan-Africanists, which were highlighted in Dr. Hutton's presentation. And most of those Pan-Africanists are from the Caribbean and speaking about trying to bring back Africa with its diaspora. In fact, the current term is Global Africa, speaking to Africa and her diaspora. And I think as, I don't know if she's Dr. Prasad said, if there had been a declaration of CARICOM as the sixth region of Africa, the heads of government would have been involved, there would have been a signing, there would have been some kind of major engagement of the region. It is non-existent, it does not exist. And the whole declaration of the diaspora, the African diaspora as the sixth region of Africa, goes back, I think, to either 2008 or 2012, when we had the Global African Diaspora Summit of heads of state of countries that have large populations of African people. And that summit was in South Africa in May of 2012. And the whole concept of the diaspora of the sixth region was cemented there. So most of these questions really do not apply. The situation is that it is about Africa fostering a reconnection with its diaspora, welcoming them back home, looking at the ways in which Africa and her diaspora can collaborate for the development of both regions, and for collaborating on common issues of diplomatic concern. And so really what I want to say is that CARICOM is very much aware that this is a multicultural region. And there is no way you can imagine the prime ministers of Trinidad or Guyana ever agree to any kind of declaration it's not a geopolitical construct. It is based on ethnicity and a historical experience of the dispersion of Africans. So I want to assure you that there is no such declaration and that there is no way that the CARICOM as a community could ever sign on to something that does not recognize the multi-ethnic nature of this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Professor Patricia Mohammed, you wanted to make a comment? You need to unmute, please.
Sorry, thank you, Dr. Brown. And you know, this has been a very interesting and outspoken, necessarily the kind of debates that we need to have. We need to confront things that we sometimes put under the carpet. I do want to raise a point though, and that is that both the newspaper report and, as Dr. Mahaber pointed, the UE press release stated it was a declaration, have never been retracted. And what I think we have to go on, what I think we have to work with in the contemporary world is the optics of what emerges when statements like that come out, what signals it sends, and what it begins to create in the minds of people. That is the modern world. We live in a world where fake news becomes news, and reality takes on different ways in which it has a life of its own. So I want to say that it is dangerous. It is still serious despite it's not being true or valid. And I think it needs to be dealt with, as I have called for as well, transparently, openly, with dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Patricia Mohammed. Dr. Andira Rasad, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Shalima. Dr. Hilary Brown, I really appreciate the clarification. I appreciate it, but we can't afford to make these kinds of mistakes. The newspaper, we know they have agendas. They have all kinds of agendas, and they have to sell newspapers. I think the number one is an economic agenda. I always say that. I've been engaged in newspaper, as a columnist for a long time. I think I understand the insides of their workings. But when you issue an official press release, and as a member of the university community, and as a representative, I'm a union representative of staff who are writing me and up in arms about this. I didn't organize this forum. It was sheer coincidence that Dr. Mahaber asked me if I would speak on it. I didn't organize it. I had nothing to do with it, except as an invitee here today. Okay, so I came to speak my mind, and I spoke my mind because it is causing consternation in the academic community and in the Indo-Caribbean community, not just in Trinidad. Because my concern is, how come a leader like Irfan Ali didn't respond to this? We were certainly, you said our leaders. We have one Indo leader, I think, right now in CARICOM, Mr. Irfan Ali, if I am correct.
Santoki of President Santoki, Suriname.
Okay, so yes, so we have two, and both of them are members of CARICOM. CARICOM actually has almost 19 million people, and 3 countries of those have majority Indian populations, but 2 at least, Guyana and Trinidad, they're majority, although by a small amount. And I don't like to get into the numbers game, because I really don't think it is a salient issue. I don't like to get into the numbers game, because we are claiming identity and a sense of belonging and inclusion by numbers, and I don't think that is right. I don't think that's the argument and the salient argument that we should be looking at. But the UE has a responsibility, and this is something I'm going to raise in UE, to issue accurate press statements. They have, and as a member of staff, I have a responsibility to bring this to their attention. Right? So I will do so. But I also think ICC, that as the preeminent activist institution in the region, there is no other Indo-Caribbean institution as the preeminent activist Indo institution, diaspora. It's not just Caribbean, it's diaspora. Because we engage the Indo diaspora here. Well, the organizers engage the Indo diaspora. I've been in several of their forums to write to these various bodies. The Newsday, for one, we will have to address this, and they would have to send out an apology. Whoever issued the press release in UE, they have to issue an apology. These statements are hurtful. They're painful to some people who were born and bred and struggled here and making a significant contribution like everyone else of all ethnicities. Notice I did not single out an ethnicity, and I recognized the role of the Africans in the Caribbean. And I recognize the connections with Africa, as I recognize the Indians with India. Okay, and there are others, there are many others. So we can't on the one hand practice inclusion, and on the other, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. Okay, and we're contradicting ourselves. And the intellectuals, the academics, and the thinkers And the ordinary person in the street who is thinking will want to know, and who sees such headlines, will want to know what's going on here. And we don't, this divide and rule thing, you know, we don't want to stoke divisions. We have enough issues to deal with. We have climate change, we're in economic crisis, we have crime running out of, you know, escalating, running out of proportion in the region, and Trinidad, people are going crazy. Right? We don't want to spend our time having to correct mistakes of other people. Okay, and was it intentional? Was it deliberate? Was it
I think it
a
was.
mistake? That is the other question I want to ask. Was it really a mistake? I want to
Okay.
ask a question and stop there. Thank you.
Dr. Rampasad, thank you so much.
Quickly, if I could just.
Dr. Brown,
Yes.
Dr. Brown, Professor Hutton, I'm going to ask you to just withhold your comments for just 2 minutes. Unfortunately, we are 20 minutes beyond our normal time. And so we absolutely need to bring today's recording to a close. So I want to say thank you so much to all of our speakers. You've sacrificed, you've given freely of your time, your knowledge, and your experience, and we absolutely appreciated all that you've shared with us. I also want to thank all the members of our audience on Zoom and on YouTube for attending and participating. Shakira will now formally close the program. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Shalama, and thank you to all of our participants. As we said earlier, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and we wish to inform you our topic next Sunday will be the Chinese indentureship in the Caribbean. So you can visit our YouTube channel to see all our past recordings. I am Shakira Mohammed from Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyavad.
Adios.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Maybe we can give Miss Hillary 1 minute and Dr. Brown, sorry.
Yeah, we're not hearing you well, Dr. Mahabir.
Okay, maybe we can give Dr. Hillary 1 minute and Professor Hutton 1 minute again before we really close.
Go ahead, please. Professor Hutton had his hand up. Dr. Brown, let's just hear him out for just a minute.
Okay.
Ravin, can you just bring the live stream to an end?